So when we think about the church technically doesn't start with Jesus. The church starts after the ascension. While Jesus is here, Jesus does what Jesus does. So when we start talking about sort of church history, we're sort of talking about sort of the earliest group of apostles, formerly known as disciples, right? The difference between ones who learn and ones who are sent. Apostles are those who are sent. And that's sort of where we start when we talk about church. So the Post-Ascension Church, immediately post-ascension, stays in Jerusalem. They do that because Jesus tells them to. Stay in the city until you have received what I am sending. And we know from the book of Acts that they continue to worship in the temple itself. Jesus himself did this, and he makes no prohibitions against this. And I'll admit this is a bit of a controversial statement that I have made in the past. Some people would disagree, but there's really no prohibition against sacrifice in Christianity explicitly, if we're going to go to sort of the teachings of Jesus. Because at the time of Jesus, the temple still stood, and that this was the place of worship, and that the means of worship in the temple with sacrifice was sort of all implied. What we actually see, and I mentioned this a little bit in my sermon last week, what we actually see is some of the gospel writers and early authors of the texts of the New Testament sort of wrestling with what happens post-temple, right? None of the gospels were written while the temple still stood. So when you hear all these predictions about the temple falling and the destruction and the rebuilding, and it means Jesus' body, but does it mean the building? That's part of sort of Jewish believing Jews dealing with the loss of this significant central place of worship, in the same way that the Jewish people will be wrestling with the same things post Second Temple fall. Now, I say from the ascension until the day of Pentecost, so at least those 10-ish days, they stayed in Jerusalem. And there are at least several apostles who will remain in Jerusalem almost exclusively. Peter, for one, until, of course, his martyrdom, and James of Jerusalem, otherwise known as James, the brother of Jesus, who becomes head of the Jerusalem Council. That's sort of the 12 apostles plus Matthias, the 11th plus Matthias, sort of stay and become the council in Jerusalem. When we hear things in Acts like they laid everything at the apostles' feet, it's that group that we're talking about. Now, after the Pentecost, after the descent of the Spirit, we do know that there are several apostles who journeyed beyond Jerusalem with the message of Jesus. And some of this is tradition more than scripture, but some of it is scripture itself. So we know that Philip is sent by the Spirit to Damascus, and on the way, he meets the Ethiopian eunuch, the one who is sort of chief steward to the Ethiopian Candace, or queen. But in the moment of baptism, the eunuch sees him no more, and Peter finds himself in Azotus and continues all the way up to Caesarea Philippi, proclaiming the gospel. Paul, of course, plants churches all over the Mediterranean. Now, while Paul isn't one of the original 12, and actually isn't one of the secondary 12, Paul's sort of the 13th apostle, nonetheless, we see that there are plenty of times when he talks about, oh, were you baptized by Apollos? Were you baptized by Cephas or Peter? Were you baptized by so-and-so? Meaning that he was encountering communities that were founded by some of the apostles. Tradition will tell us about others who travel beyond Jerusalem. Mark is known to have founded the church in Venice, right? That's why that's why Venice has the symbol of a winged lion for Saint Mark. Interestingly enough, Mark will also be credited with Alexandria. Give me just 1 second. I'm going to try to switch over to my hotspot because it looks like I have terrible signal for some reason today. And let's see what we can do with this. I'm going to stop the share. Give me just 1 second. Okay, are we back? We're doing okay? If we're doing okay. All right. So we also know that Thomas is credited with founding the church in India. As a matter of fact, if you ever want to have a wonderful conversation, the next time Dean Sebastian from the seminary comes, he is ordained in the Church of South India, and he will be more than happy to tell you about the connection of Thomas and the church there. The thing is, as many of these churches as were founded in the early days, the main worship was still either in the temple or in the synagogue. Going to church wasn't a thing, because there wasn't one. The earliest church was just a sect of Judaism that believed in Jesus, right? So Jesus believing Jews. And so Christians would still go to synagogue or the temple and then would later come around and, sort of have lunch at a believer's house afterwards and talk about Jesus, right? Or would perhaps stand up in the study period that was synagogue and talk about Jesus. But the idea of church, not really a thing. Now, post-temple church, so the temple falls in 66 CE, right around the time that the Gospel of Mark is written down. Worship dramatically changes for the Jewish people, of whom Jesus-believing Jews were a part. So that the church really has this springboard of no longer having the temple to worship in. So what ends up happening is that Judaism goes to synagogue-based worship. And synagogue is a Greek word for assembly. It becomes important to Jewish worship to the present day, where the focus transitions from sacrifice, which can only be done in the temple, to study of scripture and study of life, right? Which is why so much of Jewish worship is now centered around the reading of scripture, the singing of the Psalms, right? It's so much of that as a basis for worship. Christians would also meet in the synagogues. Maybe we talk about Jesus, and then we would go and have lunch afterwards at a believer's house. Now, that being said, what's been known as the expulsion from the synagogues in 85 CE-ish, is that Christians were expelled, quote, expelled from synagogues, which led to the need for yet a new way of worship for Christians. This is not the need for us to in any way be anti-Semitic. What happens in 85 CE is that the Roman Empire starts to see that there's some tension in the synagogues because Christians are becoming more vocal. We're sort of trying to take over. We're trying to convert people. And there's tension in the synagogues. And this is a problem for the Roman Empire because the synagogues have been allowed to exist because, again, as I've said in other classes, Judaism was respected by Rome because it was a religion that predated their own. And so Judaism was allowed to sort of continue its worship. Rome had a respect for everything that came before it, so long as they could control it. And what they were finding is that they couldn't control these disputes that were happening sort of in these communities. And they started to put pressure on these Jewish synagogues to sort of get themselves under control. And the only way that that could happen was for the Christians who were really kind of getting in the way to leave. This leads to some issues, right? I talked about this again last week. What happens is there becomes a lot of very anti-Semitic language in scripture, in Christian scripture. The only gospel really that was probably written after the expulsion from the synagogues was John. And I've said it before, I'll say it again. The Gospel of John, as beautiful as its poetry is incredibly anti-Semitic. It's the only gospel that that really lays the entirety of the crucifixion at the feet of the Jews who did not believe in Jesus, rather than at the foot of the Roman Empire, right? Because it was a community trying to process its grief. That's not an excuse. It was an awful thing to do, and something we still need to live with in our scripture. But we can see that, right? We can see it in a few other places. Paul talks about not being able to meet in synagogues anymore. And people try to sort of wrestle with what that means. But what it means really for Christianity as a whole is that we got to figure out a new way and a new place to worship, because we don't have the place we've been used to. So we come up with an idea. Oh yeah, please.
Couldn't they just continue to meet in their homes?
So we just got there. So we came up with this great idea, the Domus Ecclesiae, the house church, literally house church. And so what happens, where before it was go to synagogue for worship, talk about Jesus over lunch, now everything happens in the home. So Christianity continues to gather. Christians continue to get together, right? This is not the end of Christianity, obviously, with the, quote, expulsion from the synagogues. But where I think we've often been led by popular culture to think that, oh, and so we met in the catacombs where people were buried, and that's where we met in secret. We did. There is definitely evidence of worship happening in the synagogues among the dead. Not nearly as much as I think we've been led to believe, right? There are definitely chapels and altars in the catacombs, but probably much more around like anniversaries of deaths, feast days, certain sects of Christianity, but not as a whole. As a whole, we sort of move to house churches. Basically, the idea is that wealthy Christians would welcome the community from their area to come into their larger house that they owned, and that's important, for these gatherings. What we need to remember is, for Christians, there is an inability to build permanent worship dedicated spaces publicly because Christianity is still illegal, right? So long as Christianity was seen as a sect of Judaism, there wasn't a big problem. Once Christianity spins off on its own, which is what happens, around 85, then it becomes illegal because we're not a protected class. We are a new religion, right? We are younger than Rome. And so there's a problem there. So we can't build churches. We can't build spaces dedicated to worship. So instead, wealthy Roman citizens, because they had to own their home, would sort of convert a couple of rooms. And we'll talk about that as we go. What's really amazing about these isn't so much that people gave up their space, because people do that today. There are house churches today. We have gatherings in people's home today, but that these were some of the earliest, most equitable gatherings where free and slave and male and female and citizen and foreigner were sort of all together in one space. Now, again, that's not to compare to Judaism and the synagogues. That wasn't to compare to other sects of religion in Rome. What this is to say is in someone's home, right? Which is why this is so crazy. It's not that a group of religious people saw this equity. We see that in various religions of the time. It's that it's in someone's home. Sunday, and this is around the time that we start to have Sunday as the day of gathering, noted by Justin Martyr in his apology, because of the resurrection, right? Early on the first day of the week, when it was early dawn, before the sun had risen, the women came to the tomb bearing spices, right? Is how Matthew tells the story. What's curious is, yes.
Oh, At this time, were followers of the way calling themselves Christians yet?
So around this time we start to see that, because we certainly know that that's language that Justin Martyr will use in about 150. So we're sort of transitioning to that because we are now sort of by situation our own religion, and so we got to come up with something. That's not to say that, I mean, people, there's a few times in the book of Acts when the way are called Christians, earlier than this, but sort of as a religion, yes, this would sort of be around the time that we're getting to Christianity. And when I say around the time, I'm talking, for those of you that have ever studied ancient religion or ancient history, I'm talking about like within 100 years of this time, sort of 50 years in either direction. Yes, this is around that time. But what I want us to know is key when we read people like Justin Martyr, who was one of the early church fathers. Sunday is chosen because of its connection to the resurrection and is known as the Lord's Day, not Sabbath. Christians did not try to usurp Sabbath for Sunday worship. So when we have things like the Ten Commandments saying you shall honor the Sabbath day, that's still Saturday. Christians are meeting a separate day for worship. We have to remember this is a time when weekends weren't a thing, so you worked 7 days a week anyway, but you would sort of go to church before the sun came up on Sunday morning, have church for a while, and then go to work, right? There was no sense of sort of us taking this over as the Sabbath. I know there are plenty of folks in the world today that think that's the case, right? For Christians, Sabbath is Sunday. For Jews, Sabbath is Saturday. There's no evidence of that ever happening, except in our own minds because we wanted to be special. So this is, it's a big chunk of text. I'm not going to read the whole chunk of text. If you ever want to read the first apology of Justin Martyr, it's fascinating. Basically, Justin Martyr is caught, put on trial, and writes a fabulous defense of Christianity. But this is how he talks about worship, and we've talked about this a little bit before. But we see here, let me see if I can highlight it. Oh, nope. And on the day called Sunday, all who live in cities or in the country gather together in one place, and the memoirs of the apostles or the writings of the prophets are read as long as time permits. Then when the reader has ceased, the president, that's the pastor, verbally instructs and exhorts to the imitation of these good things. Then we all rise together and pray, and as we before said, when our prayer is ended, bread and wine and water are brought, and the president in like manner offers prayer and thanksgivings according to their ability, and the people assent, saying Amen. And there is a distribution to each, and to those who are absent, a portion is sent by the deacons, right? That's the early idea of deacons. And they who are well-to-do and willing give what each thinks fit, and what is collected is deposited with the president, who succors the orphans and widows and those who through sickness or any other cause are in want. But then, and this is where I was getting this before, but Sundays is the day on which we all hold our common assembly, because it is the first day on which God, having wrought a change in the darkness and matter, made the world, and Jesus Christ our Savior on the same day rose from the dead. For he was crucified on the day before that of Saturn, and on the day after that of Saturn, which is the day of the sun, having appeared to his apostles and disciples, he taught them these things, which we have submitted to you also for your consideration. What's very key about this, just in church history and liturgy history, this changes our way of thinking about worship, so that things like communion itself, right, the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, here, by Justin Martyr in about 150, is connected to resurrection appearances and not to Maundy Thursday. That becomes key because it's part of the great debate of how often should we have communion, right? And the argument for us today is that communion is the feast of the baptized, it is the feast of the resurrection, right? It is an Easter feast. And that seems to be what the connection is here, right? This is where we get these ideas that the church gathers on this side of the resurrection as Easter people. So let's see. So we've had Post-Ascension Church, Post-Pentecost Church, Post-Temple Church, and then we had Post-Synagogue Church. Now we have the Post-Constantinian Church. I'm just making these up. These are not real phrases. These are just things I'm making up for the sake of this slideshow. On the 20th of October in 312 CE, as part of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine the Great, Constantine the First, Constantine Emperor of Rome, the Caesar, saw a vision of a Chi-Rho, that's a P with the X through it, and heard a voice say, Tutunika, right? In this sign, conquer. And asking the people around him what this means, right? Sort of drawing what he sees in the sky. He writes it down and says, what does this mean? And they say, oh, well, that's a sign for Christ. That's sort of the God of the Christians is the one telling you to conquer in this sign. And as tradition goes on to say, Constantine sort of paints it on all his battle garb and does indeed win the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. And as the story has come down to us, he's immediately on the spot converted to Christianity. Not exactly on the spot, but we do know that Christianity is legalized in the Edict of Milan in 313. So whether or not Constantine himself is converted, as he kind of claims he is, there's some debate. I would argue he's hedging his bets, because he kind of gets baptized very late in life, almost on his deathbed. But nonetheless, he does legalize Christianity, which means that we now can build public churches. Yes.
Now, his mother was Christian. Was she Christian now? Like before
yes.
it happened? Or was Christian?
She was sort
Helena?
of the guilty. I would say Helena was kind of the guilty secret. If you've ever seen, by the way, for anyone that's curious, if you've ever seen like the papal masses at St. Peter's and you see the altar under the dome and you see the 4 columns with the statues, the woman holding the cross, who's in that inner circle, is Helena, right? Mother of Constantine, credited with part of why Constantine became Christian, and definitely credited with things like finding the pieces of the Holy Cross and founding Church of the Holy Sepulchre, etc. Most of that work that she does, as a matter of fact, all of that work she does about founding churches and looking for relics, and she basically spends the rest of her life on royal pilgrimage around the Mediterranean, finding everything that Christians ever needed to have an artifact of. That's all done as mother of the emperor after his conversion, after its legality. She was a Christian, she was a believer before this. What's unclear is what that relationship was. And I'm sure somebody's written a bio about it, but I'll be honest, the last I checked in, we're not entirely sure if he knew. We don't know if she sort of was kind of nudging him behind the scenes, and then he finally gave in sort of around this time and credits this moment so that he can take the credit, which sounds like a Roman emperor to me. But regardless, yes, his mother was a Christian, frankly, as was Monica, the mother of Augustine, before Augustine converts to Christianity. So mothers are a big deal, right? Lois and Eunice, the mother and grandmother of Timothy, are named in the book of Timothy as being these exemplars in the church. Mothers are very important. But she was a Christian before this, and then afterwards is a big deal in church stuff. Relics are credited to her, churches are credited to her. The Basilica of Santa Croce in Jerusalem, the Holy Cross in Jerusalem, which is in Rome, that church is credited to her. All these things, big deal, which was sort of part of the palatial complex of the mother of the emperor over in the Lateran. We'll talk about that. Thank you for that. So when we are finally legally allowed to build churches, what do? We build basilicas. Now, for those of us in the 21st century, we think of basilica as things like St. Peter's or St. Peter and Paul's here in Philadelphia. or the National Basilica of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C. We think of basilica sort of as the bishop's church in an area, but basilica actually isn't a church creation. Basilica far predates the church and our use of buildings. The structure of the basilica, so this building, known as the basilica, is one long, big sort of nave with central aisle, which is kind of taller than the rest, and sort of two smaller aisles, one on each side. Sometimes more than that, but definitely one big aisle, two little aisles, one on each side. Was actually the shape of Roman and political buildings in Rome. So if you go and walk through the Roman Forum today, or frankly, the Forum in any Roman city, you will see the footprints of a basilica. It was not a church. It was where the court was held. It's where you could go and plead your case. It's where you went with your disputes. So that the apse, that's the half round thing at the end, where we think the altar belongs, would actually be where the magistrate would sit and hold court. And then sort of along the sides would be various places for the lawyers to be and the legal representatives to be, and all of that kind of business was on the sides in those smaller aisles. And you sort of would use the central aisle for this gathering. So that the connection of this usage is not something the Christians create. We actually take it from the Romans, make it our own. And I would argue, without even knowing, this is a profound prefigurement of the way that Christianity and imperialism will work hand in hand into the present day. This is us saying, you know what, we're not going to come up with our own building. We're going to use the most powerful building architecture that's known in the Roman Empire, right? The place of law and business. And we are going to use it and make it a church. And I think in a lot of ways, we are still working from that. Yes, John.
I have a question about the basilica.
Yes.
I'm not sure. I might be mixed up. I might be totally mixed up, but I think I read or heard somewhere, somewhere in the distant past, that one characteristic of a basilica is that it has a sort of a narthex.
Yes.
Entrance.
So there are. I mean, if we're thinking about the fact that we're working mostly with ruins except for churches, right? Because like legal basilicas don't exist in the way that we have sort of church basilicas still in existence. But yes, generally, if you think sort of the classic cathedral idea of like you walk into a lobby and then there was a tall central nave and tall central aisle, because nave is a church word, tall central area and then two side aisles.
Yeah.
Yes, you're generally in the right direction. And
we have a basilica of our own downtown.
Correct. Right, the Basilica of Peter and Paul in Center City. And I should add, sort of most of them sort of had that sort of half round apse where the magistrate sat at the one end. Perhaps there was a statue of Caesar there, so you knew who was really in charge. But yes, generally, if we think sort of the classic shape of a church building, we're going to think of basilica. Okay. You're right.
Thanks.
Now, there are, and we'll talk about these, several churches built in other shapes, such as San Vitale. I showed some pictures of that before. San Vitale in Ravenna is an 8-sided octagonal church. And they're also called basilicas, right? The Basilica of San Vitale is actually 8 sides. Curiously enough, if you take a look at it, there's a taller central area with then outer rings of aisles, and there's an apse, but it's not sort of this long rectangle that we think of, because we take over the word basilica to imply a church. Not just any church. We take it over to imply a church run by a bishop. There's always a seat for a bishop in a basilica. And to this day, basilicas have direct connection to the Pope, right? There are 4 major basilicas in Rome: St. John Lateran, St. Mary Major, St. Paul's outside the walls, and St. Peter's in Vatican City. Those are the four major basilicas over which the Pope is bishop. There is no other bishop that sits there. There's 1,810 minor basilicas, one here in Philadelphia, one in Waterbury, Connecticut, actually, where my graduation ceremony was, that are officially under the auspices of the Pope, but have some other things. But we take we take basilica away from its legal purpose and give it a specifically church purpose. Again, sort of this connection of church and imperialism is still very much alive. The first official church to be built legally was the Lateran, was St. John in Lateran. We'll look at pictures of all of these, which to this day, St. John Lateran is the seat of the Bishop of Rome. So that we think of the Pope and his see, right, the seat of the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. We think of that as being St. Peter's, right? Because that's where he lives, and that's where he reigns from, and that's where he speaks from, and that's where Mass is always said, right? Papal Mass is always at St. Peter's. But technically, the Bishop of Rome, his seat is in St. John Lateran, the first church built legally under the auspices of Rome. And to this day, if you pay attention and you watch the Papal Mass for Maundy Thursday, the day when we remember the institution of the Lord's Supper, and for Catholics, it's the institution of the priesthood, that Mass is always said at St. John Lateran, where the Pope will say Mass and then wash feet. And it's a pretty big deal. And then there's often sort of a communion procession from there to to the Basilica of the Holy Cross, but that's still what's there. So it's still a powerful building. So let's look at some pictures, because there's been a lot of words and a lot of history. So I talked about the Domus Ecclesiae, the house church. This is the oldest, and to the best of my knowledge, the only existing sort of structure of a house church we have in the ruins of Dura Europos. Great. If anybody ever gets a chance to see the frescoes from Dura Europos, either from the synagogue or the house church, because there's a house synagogue and a house church, which are kind of like on the same street. Actually, it's very interesting. They're fabulous. I got a chance to see some of them when they were at the Yale Art Gallery. They're amazing. But if you look, and for those that have ever studied anything about Roman architecture, you'll know this looks like a Roman house. Basically, you walk in, there's a courtyard, and there's some rooms around the outside of what would have been an open, this sort of B here in the middle would have been an open courtyard, sort of roof open. It looks like a regular house until you look at some things like this, which are the baptistry, right? Over here, there's a special niche, and I'll show pictures of these, where there would have been a pool of water. This would have been very similar to a mikveh that would have been in a synagogue, a place where people would have taken their ritual bathing, but we know this one isn't that. And then sort of this large room on the side like this, being so big instead of little rooms like this, shows that this was much more for sort of communal gathering. There was clearly some remodeling done of this house, because there really normally wouldn't have been quite such a big singular room anywhere. But from the front, it would have looked like a regular house. Nobody would have known any different. And if you walked in, it didn't go all the way to the back corners of the house, you would have said, oh, we're in a regular house. Until you looked at the frescoes. So this is the baptistry in the house church of Dura Europos. As you see, there's sort of this rectangular bathtub under an arch, very reminiscent of some of the niches in the catacombs that are known, with these beautiful frescoes on the walls. Here we see two women carrying candles, one of them carrying a jar of ointments as they approach a sarcophagus. How do we know that this was a place of baptism? Because this is literally a depiction of Easter. The women arriving at the tomb early in the morning, that's why they have candles, symbol of the resurrection, signs of baptism, right? What's interesting, if you think about the, you always want to think about how churches are laid out. You would get into, as you stepped into this tub, you're facing west. You're facing the setting sun. You can't go through this baptistry because there's a wall on the backside. So you would get in, get wet, get out. So you would get in facing the setting sun and necessarily get out facing the rising sun, symbolic of death and resurrection, which then we have Jesus' resurrection right over here on the side wall. Also on the walls of the baptistry, here is the paralytic man taking up his bed, quite literally, and walking, signs of healing. And here is Jesus and Peter walking on the water. More water imagery, right? So here's the disciples in the ship. Here's Jesus and Peter out in the middle of the water. Now, this is about you got to piece together what the rest of the picture looked like. These are very old and the building itself no longer exists. But quite lovely here in the baptistry in Dura Europus. We go from the house church, that sort of simple little house. Somebody converted a couple of rooms for common use. This would have been one of the bigger rooms, more elaborate rooms. And we get to St. John Lateran right here, the first official basilica built. Now, this is the remodel. This is the rebuild of the Lateran after the fires that destroyed most of the basilica, but it's not far off. It's not far off from what the original would have looked like. Obviously, we have come through with Renaissance artists putting statues on top and all that sort of stuff, but not far off. We see the main central aisle, and then at least one here, we have 4 side aisles, right? At least one aisle on each side. Here we have 2. This is what it looks like inside. Now, again, lots of this being redone after the fires destroyed the original, but a good deal of this here in the end over here in the apse, these mosaics, being very close to the original, right? We have Jesus reigning in the sky with Mary and John the Baptist. How do we know? Because he's dressed in raggedy clothes. And here at the far end in the apse, backed by gold, as you will see, is the see of the Bishop of Rome. This is the cathedra of the Bishop of Rome, of the Pope. As much as we think of St. Peter's, this is it. Here's the floor plan of St. John Lateran, right? So we have a central aisle with 2 here side aisles. Here's the nave John was talking about. Here's the narthex John was talking about, the idea of sort of stepping into the lobby. Here's the apse. And here's the altar. Here's the thing about the altar, and frankly, the whole structure. Don't think furniture, right? We think today of like, oh, where's the altar? Where's the font? Where's the pulpit? Where's the pews? Where's the seats, right? Where's the organ? Largely an empty building. Most churches built, most basilicas built, most churches built, the altar was not permanently in one place, right? It was movable. Some of them a little bit more so, right? We know sort of the grandness of St. Peter's to this day. Sort of the current St. Peter's has a very permanent altar over the tomb of Peter. But everything was movable and there were no pews. The only person that got to sit down was the bishop. He got a seat. In the end, in the apse, like the magistrates. Everybody else stood up. Where did you stand? Probably not in the central aisle. This big central aisle, very likely clergy only. There's actually some ancient churches currently being excavated where there's actually sort of a setup of sort of stones on their edge to demarcate in the floor. You can't go further than this. Here we have columns set up, and sort of the expectation would be, the bishop and the clergy would be in the middle aisle, in the big part, in the big important part, and everybody else would kind of come up these side aisles. Perhaps why there was 2 aisles, this idea that you would sort of come up one side, get your communion, drop off your offering, and come up the other aisle, right? But again, the specific use of space, we don't know, because they're largely empty buildings and they were not saying 15 masses a day. there were other things happening in these spaces. They were big, empty spaces for worship and other business of the bishop. This is the Lateran now. So we see sort of all these pieces that are built around what's now the Lateran complex. Here we have the Lateran Palace, for a while the home of the Bishop of Rome, or the Pope, and sort of some of these rebuilds, these side chapels being added, etc. Gorgeous. But as I said, not everybody gets to be a rectangle. Here we have the outside of the Church of Santo Stefano in Rotondo, St. Stephen in the Round. This one is actually really pretty unique because when we say round, we mean round. This is not rounded. This is not 8 or 12 sides. This is circle. This is church in a circle. To this day, not a popular shape for a church. Right? If we think about even church in the round, which I think is a beautiful way to do church, it's usually a square or an octave, right? It's a sort of shape with some flat sides somewhere. What's interesting, and you can see it in St. John Lateran, is you see the axis. Here's the front door, here's the altar, here's the bishop's seat. This is the axis going east and west. This is the west, this is the east, right? Altars always face east when you stand at them. You're facing east, even if you're not, but east facing, right, west. But you see the axis, front door to the back. Then you get to Santo Stefano, and you think there's no axis, right? Because it's in the round. Of course there wouldn't be. I want to point out here what's really interesting is you do see a higher middle with two outer aisles. So we still couldn't give up on this idea of like a bigger, higher central place and two sort of shorter outer aisles, right? We couldn't give up on that, but we did say, oh, but let's make it round. Here's the ceiling. I want to show you this. This is a reproduction of what the ceiling looked like. The current ceiling's blank. Look familiar? Looks like the ceiling of the baptistry of the Orthodox. One of the only other times that we see something round in the early church, with the Chi-Rho in the middle, right? So this is the Constantinian seal. This is sort of what Constantine describes as his vision in the sky. This is what Santo Stefano looks like. And so we have altar in the middle with a high central area with the altar, and then two shorter exterior aisles. So again, if you kind of take a basilica and wrap it in a ring, you get Santo Stefano. And what I want to point out is there's still an apse that shows that there is still an axis. Now it's a little off axis because here's the door, so you would think this is the axis, but here's the axis. There's still this axis that always happens. We can't quite give up on that, even as beautiful as Church in the Round is. And frankly, I just love looking at the roof because I just think this is its own engineering miracle. Here's San Vitale, what we think of as Church in the Round today, because it's round-ish. But this is the Basilica of this is the Basilica of San Vitale, where we see the narthex, the high central area with one aisle, but these sort of side porticos, so we'll count that as two aisles, but there's still a huge apse. You still have this axis. The crazy thing about San Vitale is the narthex doesn't fit on that axis. You don't enter by the door that faces the altar. But I also want to point out what becomes a very key part of Christian architecture. San Vitale is Church in the Round, even with an axis. It's 8 sides. San Vitale is not round, it has 8 sides. 8 becomes a very important number. To this day, in Christianity. I've talked about this a little bit before, right? But the idea is that when that Christ rising on the first day of the week before dawn is actually the mystical 8th day, right? 8 being the number of perfection. 7 days of creation, 8th day equals perfection, right? 8th day is resurrection. Sunday morning when we gather in worship, it's technically the 8th day of the week. As we leave, we go back into the first day of the week. Sort of that mystical place and time of perfection into which we are baptized. We are baptized into the mystical 8th day, the day of resurrection, the day of perfection. And what we see is it starts to show in our architecture. Let's talk about what's inside. This is the altar of St. John Lateran. Again, not original, but we go from literally like a bathtub in a back corner of a house to huge, tall, major gilt basilicas. The difference between illegal Christianity and legal Christianity is major. The connection between the powerless and the marginalized, preaching about love for the marginalized, and those with the ultimate authority in Rome claiming the religion is major. And what happens is from about 312 with Constantine, until the mid to late 20th century, so until like the 50s to the 80s, we sort of see this increasing, ever-growing connection between Christianity and imperialism and capitalism and power and politics and law, because it is legal. And as it grows and spreads, it becomes the religion. Why? Because those in charge, right, the emperor is Christian. What does that mean? Everybody's Christian, right? We start to see the sort of the dissolution of the ancient cults, right? The mythological cults, some of which bleeds into Christianity, right? The cults of Dionysus and Mithras sound a lot like Christianity when you get down to it. So we see ways that they bleed in, but sort of as we grow and get more powerful, so does our worship space. So does the church. Good thing, bad thing? Well, I will allow history itself to decide that and not say for myself. I will say that I think it's really dangerous when the Pope, Pontifex Maximus, is a title that the Roman Emperor used for himself. So that today, titles that are used still by the Pope, Pontifex Maximus being one of them, is a title of the Roman Emperor. So that no longer is the Pope outside of government, but is to this day successor of Peter and of Caesar, arguably. I'd say that might pose a problem, and that's not Catholicism, right? As children of the Reformation, as Lutherans, we trace ourselves back through Rome, so we are not exempt from this. So I just think it's something that it's interesting that we go from sort of these converted houses to like these grand, amazing, huge, powerful gilt basilicas. And I think there's something to that, right? Part of the idea of these beautiful, big, grand spaces is that they do draw your eye upwards. They draw your imagination wider. The art in them, at least in theory, is meant to teach as much as be beautiful, right? So that those who could not read could understand the stories. So this is not a criticism of some beautiful art. And certainly for a long time, the church was the only thing sponsoring art and literature and the sciences. So it's not to say any of that, because they do serve their purposes. Did the Becks have a question? It looked like the Becks had a question. No? No, okay. Now, why do I show now Westminster Abbey, which is a little blurry, I'll admit, but I took the picture offline. Because we have, when we talk about altars, kind of two different options. We have altar in the middle. right? The bishop that stands at this altar can get all the way around the altar. This is the more original version of altars. In Christianity, in Christian churches, this is the more original version of altars, not what we have here, which is an east-facing altar. The idea that the altar is against the easternmost wall, right? Remember the east-west axis, where the priest stands with his back to the congregation. That grows into an idea because it draws on some of sort of ancient cultures of sacrifice, etc. It also makes what happens on the altar that much more mystical, because now not only are you doing it in Latin that most people have stopped speaking, but you're also doing it so no one can see what you're doing, right? It becomes this very private thing, and when it's your turn, I'll put something on your tongue, but you don't get to see what it is, right? But it's this whole idea of facing east, facing the rising sun, facing whatever, but that's much more this sort of model. If you see sort of, I mean, even here, technically, the altar isn't against the wall, but there's, for purposes of worship, there's nothing behind this wall because it's not a public space. Public space, I mean, it is, but if you think sort of the nave of Westminster Abbey, you're looking at the east wall. And we go from all of that to this. This is the altar in Augustus Trapp. Augustus Lutheran Church in Trapp is the first church building that Muhlenberg will build. It's in Trapp. It's just up Germantown Avenue. You can get in most times of the year, although with COVID, probably not right now. This is Muhlenberg's pulpit, still to this day. And this is the altar, a box. He had the farmers in town build a box. Now, with lovely candlesticks and linens, and it was treated with care, but a simple box with simple walls, because this is what the people needed, right? The people needed a place to gather out of the wind and rain. That's what they needed, and that's what they got. And so this is sort of now to juxtapose sort of the grandiose basilicas to the altar being a table, which is much more original to sort of the idea. Which one's better? Well, I think they all have their place and their purpose, but just something for us to think about. Lest we think altars are all that it's about, we have baptistries. Baptistries were separate buildings or major chapels off the side of basilicas and cathedrals. This is the baptistry of the Lateran. So this is part of the Lateran complex of St. John Lateran, which we've already seen. This is the baptistry. It's an 8-sided building. Do I have a picture? Yes, it's an 8-sided building. The Lateran Palace baptistry is actually these 8 sides. This is a floor plan of the baptistry of the Orthodox that we've talked about a couple times already. But it's these 8 sides with these columns. And this, in the middle, inside the railing, is the font. Because Christianity from the beginning has not been the religion of a little dabble-do-ya, right? Ancient baptism was take off your clothes, get in the water, let it get all over you, and come out the other side and we'll put you in a white robe. That's baptism. It is very much related to the idea of the mikvah in Judaism, the idea that you would go in and bathe yourself, not necessarily every time you would go to worship, but at ritual times, right? In baptism, you only do it once, and you do it as an adult. You get in yourself, over your head water. You would be helped, because obviously it's all marble, you're gonna slip. You would be helped by people who are there to do it, but you would get in, get out, and you would get in facing the west and come out facing the east. Usually, at least ritually, we're pretending you would get in facing west and come out facing east. And this is what you would, this is how you would go. So this is the baptistry of the Lateran Palace. This is, as I said, the layout. We've seen the mosaics of the baptistry of the Orthodox a couple times now, but this is what that building looks like. Sort of, you see it's a square building, but it has these 8 sides. Again, 8, mystical number, day of perfection, day of baptism. Here's another ancient one. This one's a kind of a more decorative 8 because you get the half circles and the squares and whatever, but you get 8 segments of this. Again, deep in the ground, get in, get wet, whole body. This is University Lutheran Church here in Philadelphia on Penn's campus at 37th and Walnut. This is their baptistry. This is when you walk in the door, this is kind of facing from the front door. To the left is their fellowship hall, to the right is the church, and this is their baptismal font. Not very full. It's usually much fuller than this because, but they empty it during Lent and refill it during the Easter Vigil, which is what this service is a picture of. So this is about halfway through the Easter Vigil. This is how much water they get in from the pump. Here you see you get in and you get out, right? You get in one way, you get out the other way. What's curious here is this isn't east-west, this is north-south. But you go in and come out and facing into the nave. So the idea that you are entering the church through baptism is symbolized here. So you get in, get out, and it's hip deep. I mean, this isn't get your whole body. You could, right? You could lay down in this, but it's about hip deep. It's fabulous to watch adults be baptized, or even children be baptized at University Lutheran. I've been to a few when I was in seminary and college. But so we still have these being built. This is probably what, oh, yes.
Okay. You walk in. What are you wearing?
At Unilu,
Yeah.
clothes. At Unilu, like clothes and all, nobody's naked these days.
Gotcha.
Yes, no. My favorite was watching Pastor So this is Pastor Fowler. He's not there anymore. He just recently went to Trinity Lansdale, but so they're in transition. But the pastor before him, Pastor Wiesner, it was fabulous to watch him do an infant. About 3, because first of all, it's the Easter Vigil. Unilu does all 12 readings. It's now after midnight. They had to wake up the 3-year-old for baptism, and Pastor Wiesner got in his alb with swim trunks underneath, right? So and then kind of did a little dip, got a little close to the water, didn't drown the kid, right? Which was really fun to watch. Then the kid spread eagle in Pastor Wiesner's arms because he didn't want to be tipped backwards, having just woken up. As he sort of got splashed with what's warm water, right? Because it's newly filled font. It was warm water. And kind of got baptized in the name of the Father. Wait, we practiced this, and of the Son, see it's warm, and of the Holy Spirit, okay, will someone take him? Which is just fabulous. It's just so human. Anyway, all that to say, this is just to show Unilu the building was built in the 60s, 70s. So like, we're still building these things. Not a lot, but we are. This though is probably much more what we're used to for fonts, something in this shape. And what we have here, marble bowl on a pedestal, and what we see is with our 8 sides, right? So that even the font, we have the 8 sides. Mostly for us to show that there are still ways that we see these vestiges of the originals, as much as we are able to convert them into present day. It's the end of my pictures, at the end of my presentation. Are there questions, concerns? This was a big one, I know. There was a lot of just history. Questions, concerns, comments? Thank you all for bearing with me through this, especially since I know I just sent out the link. The e-news will come out tomorrow, I promise. Yes, Larry.
Oh, thank you. You read my mind. Tomorrow's e-news will have the link to the Wednesday 7 p.m. service.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
We had some issues with MailChimp today. So I was finally able to get it out. Yeah. All right. Thank you all very, very much. And I will see some of you, actually nobody on this call I'll see tomorrow. And then I'll see other folks on Wednesday and Sunday. Thanks.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.